Imagine being treated with violence and disdain by those who vowed to protect the country, unaware that you are, in fact, a decorated hero. This is the story of a war veteran, a man marked by the scars of past battles, who finds himself ignored, humiliated, and overlooked by the very society he fought to defend. At a public event, he becomes a victim of unnecessary brutality, but what his attackers don't know is that he's not just a homeless man. He's a general who now fights for his honor. Get ready for a story of struggle, revelations, and the pursuit of justice that will move you until the very last second. Don't miss a single detail of this epic journey, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now to stay updated with more stories like this. General Victor Radulescu stood at the center of the grand square, his posture impeccable, a symbol of pride and authority. He was a hero, at least that's how the public saw him. The crowd cheered, their applause filling the air as he waved to them, a faint smile tugging at his lips. But despite the accolades, Victor felt a strange emptiness gnawing at him, a feeling he couldn't shake off. His life had been built on the foundation of war, victories, and respect. Yet now, as he stood before these people, he felt more distant from them than ever before. Victor had led troops in battles that reshaped the history of his nation, earning medals and titles that most could only dream of. But as the years passed, something began to shift. The constant praise, the public celebrations, the official dinners, it all seemed hollow. What good was being a hero when the very country you fought for seemed to be crumbling, losing touch with its roots? The applause faded into the background as he scanned the crowd, his eyes glazing over. He could see the faces of the younger generation, eager to embrace the future, but completely unaware of the sacrifices made by people like him. They didn't understand the weight of history on his shoulders. To them, he was a relic of the past, a living reminder of battles long forgotten. The general didn't want to be that relic. He wanted something more, something real. There was a moment, just as the crowd began to thin out, that Victor's gaze shifted toward the edge of the square. A man stood there, his back slightly hunched, staring at the event from a distance. His clothes were ragged, a stark contrast to the polished uniforms of the soldiers that surrounded Victor. The man's gaze wasn't filled with admiration or awe, but something else. Something deeper, more penetrating. Victor frowned, his attention caught. Who was this man? Why did he feel a strange pull towards him? Johann stood motionless at the edge of the square, his eyes fixed on the spectacle before him. He had seen this scene unfold countless times. Military parades, celebrations, the pomp and circumstance of a world that seemed to live in another reality. To him it was nothing but a show, a charade played out for the benefit of those in power. He had been a part of that world once, a long time ago. But now he was nothing more than a ghost, forgotten by the country he had fought for. The streets were his home now, a cold and unforgiving place where he survived by begging for scraps, his days blending into one another. His hands were calloused from years of rough living, his face weathered by the harsh winds of life. He had once worn the same uniform the soldiers now paraded in, but that seemed like a lifetime ago. The medals that had once gleamed on his chest were now buried deep in his memories, along with the pride he had once felt. Johann was a veteran, one of the many whose service had been forgotten as soon as the war ended. He had fought bravely, been honored with medals for his courage, but none of that mattered now. The world had moved on, leaving him behind. The public, including the man standing on the podium, had no idea what it was like to be discarded, to be a hero in name only, and then be left to rot in the gutters of society. But today something was different. Today, as Johann watched the general, a strange sense of recognition washed over him. The man up there, Victor Radulescu, had been there when Johann was just a young soldier fighting on the front lines. He remembered the general's face, his commanding presence. And for a fleeting moment Johann wondered, had Victor ever thought about the soldiers like him? The ones who had given everything only to be forgotten in the aftermath? But as the crowd cheered for the general, Johann's thoughts were interrupted. A pair of soldiers noticed him standing apart from the rest, his shabby clothes making him an easy target. They approached with a stern look, their eyes cold and judgmental. "Move along, beggar," one of them barked, grabbing Johann's arm roughly. "You're in the way." Johann tried to pull away, but their grip tightened. He didn't resist. There was no point. He had learned long ago that resistance only brought more pain. The soldiers shoved him to the ground, knocking his head against the stone pavement. As he lay there, blood trickling down his forehead, Johann's eyes flickered upward, meeting the gaze of the general from across the square. Victor saw the whole thing, the violence, the humiliation. For a moment, the noise of the crowd disappeared. He felt a pang of discomfort. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him, but he couldn't place it. He had spent years building this image, this facade of power and control, and yet the sight of a fellow soldier discarded like trash made him question it all. Victor stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. The scene before him, the brutal treatment of a man who seemed to bear the marks of war on his soul, struck him like a blow to the chest. He had seen soldiers fight, die, and sacrifice for their country, but never had he witnessed such blatant disregard for their humanity. The soldiers who had attacked Johan were nothing but tools of the system he had once sworn to protect. Victor felt the weight of that realization pressing down on him, a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. His gaze was still locked on Johan, who was slowly rising from the ground, blood staining his ragged clothes. The beggar's eyes met Victor's for a brief moment, and in that fleeting exchange, something passed between them, an unspoken recognition, a silent understanding of the pain they both carried. But then, as quickly as it had come, the moment was gone. Johan turned away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Victor with nothing but his own confusion and guilt. The general's heart pounded in his chest, and he took a step forward, his body moving before his mind could catch up. He was about to call for the soldiers to stop, to demand an explanation, but he hesitated. He had spent years building an image of strength and control, of unyielding power, and he couldn't risk shattering that illusion. To show weakness in front of the crowd was unthinkable. And yet, the sight of Johan, alone and abandoned, gnawed at him. His mind wandered back to the many men and women he had fought alongside during the war. How many of them were like Johan, forgotten and discarded once their usefulness had expired? How many had returned home to nothing, left to face the harsh realities of a world that didn't care about their sacrifices? Victor's chest tightened as the realization hit him. He had become part of the very system he had once fought to protect. He had spent so many years focused on duty, on maintaining the image of a hero, that he had lost sight of the people who truly mattered. The soldiers, the veterans, the ones who had bled and died for their country. They had been discarded just like Johan, and no one had even noticed. After the event, Victor couldn't shake the image of Johan from his mind. It haunted him, following him like a shadow that refused to be shaken off. The man's face, battered and bruised, was a stark reminder of the forgotten souls who had once served their country only to be left behind. As he retired to his quarters later that evening, Victor found himself pacing, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. He had been a hero once, or at least that's what the world had called him. He had led his troops into battle, earned countless accolades, and been hailed as a symbol of strength and courage. But what had he really accomplished? What had all the medals, the speeches, the parades truly meant in the end? Nothing. Nothing compared to the realization that there were men like Johan, his own brothers in arms, living on the streets, forgotten by the very system they had fought to protect. As the night grew darker, Victor found himself drawn to the streets, as if some invisible force was guiding him. He walked aimlessly, his mind still consumed with thoughts of Johan. He didn't know why he was doing this, why he felt this strange compulsion to find the beggar, but he couldn't ignore it. He had to know more about him. He had to understand why he felt so connected to him even though their worlds seemed so far apart. Victor wandered through the city, his steps slow and deliberate, until he reached the outskirts of town. There, in a narrow alleyway, he saw the familiar figure of Johan huddled against a wall, his eyes closed, his body shivering in the cold night air. The sight struck Victor like a physical blow, and he hesitated for a moment before approaching. "Hey," Victor called softly, unsure of what to say. Johan opened his eyes, his gaze hard and distrustful. When he saw the figure standing before him, he recoiled slightly as if expecting more trouble. "Get lost, soldier," Johan muttered, his voice rough from years of disuse. But Victor was determined. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to talk." Johan looked him up and down, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the man before him. Something about Victor's presence, the way he carried himself, made Johan pause. He had been ignored, cast aside, for so long that he had stopped expecting any form of compassion. But this man, there was something different about him. "Talk?" Johan repeated, his voice filled with suspicion. "What could you possibly want to talk about?" Victor swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the question pressing on him. I saw what happened earlier. The soldiers. They shouldn't have treated you that way. You didn't deserve that. Yoan's eyes flickered with something, resentment maybe or bitterness. It doesn't matter what I deserve. The world doesn't care about people like me. And it never will. Victor felt a pang of guilt in his chest. The words stung, but they were the truth. The world had moved on, leaving men like Yoan to fend for themselves. I care, Victor said, his voice softer now. I want to help. You don't deserve to be forgotten. Yoan studied Victor for a long moment, his face unreadable. The streetlights cast a dim glow over their surroundings, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. There was something about Victor's gaze, something genuine, that made Yoan want to believe him. But the years of neglect, the endless string of promises made and broken by those who had come before, kept him wary. He had learned long ago not to trust words. Actions, he had found, were the only currency worth anything. Victor's offer to help lingered in the cold night air, a lifeline thrown to a man who had long since stopped expecting to be rescued. The bitterness that had festered inside Yoan for so many years threatened to consume him, yet a part of him, the part he'd tried so hard to bury, yearned for something more. For a moment, Yoan felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. You're not the first to say that, Yoan finally muttered, his voice rough as if dust had settled in his throat. But the truth is, it's all the same. People come, people go. And when they go, they forget. Victor shifted uncomfortably, a rush of guilt flooding him. His own life had been a series of privileges and medals, while Yoan had been left behind in the dust of history. He couldn't fathom the extent of the pain this man had endured, pain that had been inflicted by the very system Victor had once fought to uphold. I don't want to be like them, Victor said, his voice low but firm. I'm not going to forget you. I want to help you. You deserve better than this. Yoan let out a humorless laugh. Better? Better is a word for people who still have something to hold on to. What do I have left? My dignity? My pride? His eyes flickered as if weighing the worth of those intangible things. Those are long gone. All that's left is the cold, the hunger, and the memories of a war that doesn't even remember my name. Victor's heart ached at the words. He had known men like Yoan. Men who had fought and bled only to return home and be ignored, discarded by the very country they had sacrificed for. But Yoan had borne the brunt of that neglect in a way that Victor could never fully understand. He had lost everything, his family, his home, his sense of self. And now he lived on the streets, forgotten and broken. I know it's hard, Victor said softly, stepping closer. But I can help you. I don't know what you've been through, but I want to try. We can get you a place to stay, food, medical care. You don't have to live like this anymore. Yoan's eyes narrowed, suspicion still etched on his face. And what's the catch? What do you want from me in return? Victor hesitated, his words caught in his throat. The truth was, he didn't want anything from Yoan. He just wanted to make things right. But how could he explain that to a man who had been burned so many times before? How could he convey that his offer was genuine, that it came without strings attached? I don't want anything from you, Victor said, his voice steady but tinged with sincerity. I just want to help. If you let me. For a long time Yoan remained silent, his eyes studying Victor with a mixture of distrust and curiosity. Finally he gave a small shake of his head, a bitter smile playing on his lips. You don't get it, do you? You think you can just swoop in and fix everything? Life doesn't work that way. There are no easy answers. Victor felt the sting of rejection but didn't back down. I know it's not easy, he said, his voice unwavering. But I'm not giving up on you. Not after what I saw today. And I don't think you should give up on yourself either. Yoan stood up slowly, his body stiff and worn. He looked at Victor for a long moment, then turned his gaze toward the distant horizon, as if searching for something he couldn't quite reach. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed and met Victor's eyes again. Fine, Yoan said, his voice heavy with resignation. I'll give you a chance. But don't expect me to believe in miracles. Victor nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but this was a start. And for the first time in a long while he felt like he was doing something meaningful. The following weeks were a blur of uncertainty and resistance. Yoan was reluctant to trust Victor fully, his past scars too deep to be healed by mere words. He accepted Victor's help but kept his distance, retreating into a world where survival was the only currency. His interactions with Victor were curt, laced with bitterness and skepticism. Every gesture of kindness felt like a reminder of the world he had lost, and he resented it. Victor, for his part, was patient. He knew the walls around Johan's heart would not come down easily. But he also understood that this was a process, a delicate dance between hope and despair. Every step forward was a small victory, even if it was followed by 2 steps back. Victor arranged for Johan to have a small apartment, modest but safe, and provided him with food and medical care. He set up a meeting with a therapist, someone who could help Johan address the trauma he had endured. And although Johan agreed to these arrangements, he often resisted the help, pushing it away like a man who had been burned one too many times. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when Victor could see a glimmer of the man Johan had once been. During one of their conversations, Johan had opened up just a little, revealing fragments of his past. He spoke of his days in the military, the camaraderie he had felt with his fellow soldiers, and the horrors of war that still haunted him. Victor listened in silence, understanding that Johan's wounds ran far deeper than anything he could fix with a few acts of charity. One night, as Victor sat in his office, he received an unexpected phone call. It was from the same soldiers who had attacked Johan during the public event. They were requesting a meeting, and from the urgency in their voices, Victor knew this wasn't just a courtesy call. It was a matter of significant importance. Victor sat in his office, the phone still pressed against his ear, his thoughts swirling. The request from Johan's former comrades was unexpected, but there was a cold urgency in their voices that made Victor uneasy. They had never fully understood what had driven Johan to distance himself from them, but now they seemed desperate to make contact. The weight of their call lingered in the air like a shadow, a reminder that the past had a way of clawing its way into the present. After a few moments of contemplation, Victor hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, running his fingers through his hair. He wasn't sure what exactly they wanted, but he knew that any attempt to manipulate Johan would be met with resistance. The man had fought too many battles, both on the field and in his own mind, to be easily swayed. Still, there was a sense of duty, a responsibility that Victor felt deep within his bones. He couldn't just walk away from this. He had to see it through no matter what. Victor left his office and headed to Johan's apartment. The journey was silent, but his mind raced, analyzing the phone call, the potential motivations behind it. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to change everything, that whatever had been set into motion would not be easily undone. When Victor arrived at Johan's apartment, he found the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open cautiously, calling out for Johan. There was no answer. Victor stepped inside and found Johan sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window, lost in thought. His expression was unreadable, but there was a heaviness in his posture that spoke volumes. "I got a call," Victor said quietly, closing the door behind him. "From your old comrades." Johan didn't move, but his jaw tightened at the mention of the soldiers. The past, once buried beneath layers of anger and regret, began to stir within him like a forgotten beast. He had spent years trying to push it away, to forget the faces and the voices that had haunted him since the war. But now they were back, calling on him in the most unexpected way. "Why now?" Johan asked, his voice low and raw. "Why after all these years?" Victor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know, but they sounded urgent. Like they need something from you." Johan's eyes flickered with a mixture of skepticism and pain. "I don't owe them anything," he muttered. "They left me to rot while they went on with their lives. I'm done with them." Victor could hear the bitterness in Johan's voice, and for a moment he felt the weight of that resentment. But he also knew that Johan's refusal to confront his past would only prolong his suffering. He had to at least try, even if Johan wasn't ready. "I understand," Victor said softly, stepping closer to the table. "But I think it might be worth hearing them out. You can decide what to do after that." Johan finally turned his gaze to Victor, his eyes sharp but tired. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "They're the reason I ended up here. They betrayed me. They left me behind, and they expect me to just forgive them." Victor didn't respond right away. He knew that forgiveness wasn't something that could be demanded or rushed. But he also understood that Johan's refusal to confront his past would keep him chained to it forever. "Look, I'm not asking you to forgive them," Victor said, his tone firm yet compassionate. "But maybe hearing them out, understanding what happened, whatever that is, will give you the closure you need." Johan remained silent for a long time, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his chest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll listen. But don't expect me to just forget everything." Victor nodded, relieved but fully aware that this was just the beginning of a much harder journey. Johan's pain ran deep, and it would take more than a few words to heal the wounds of the past. The next day, Victor and Johan met with the soldiers who had called. The meeting was arranged in a small, neutral office, far removed from the shadows of the war that had once bound them together. The men sat on one side of the table, their faces grim and tense, while Victor and Johan sat across from them. There was an unspoken tension in the air, thick with the weight of years lost and the ghosts of their past. The soldiers, once comrades in arms, now seemed like strangers. Their uniforms were no longer a symbol of brotherhood, but a reminder of betrayal and broken bonds. Johan sat with his arms crossed, his gaze hard and unyielding. The room felt cold, the silence between them heavy with unsaid words. One of the soldiers, a tall man with graying hair and a scar across his cheek, spoke first. His voice was rough, like someone who had spent too long living with regret. "Johan, we know we've wronged you," he began, his eyes meeting Johan's with an apology that felt both sincere and hollow. "But you have to understand, we didn't leave you behind on purpose." Johan's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching on the table. "Don't feed me that," he snapped. "You all made your choices. You turned your backs on me when I needed you the most." The soldier sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't like that. We had orders. Orders that came from the top. We couldn't go against them, not without risking everything. It wasn't about you, Johan. It was about survival." Victor watched in silence, sensing the truth in the soldier's words, but also the bitter taste of justification. War, he had learned, was rarely about heroism or honor. It was about survival at any cost. And sometimes, that cost came at the expense of the people you thought you could trust. Johan's voice cracked, his anger mixing with pain. "Survival? You left me for dead. I fought with you. I bled with you. And you just abandoned me." The room grew heavy with the weight of Johan's words. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the guilt of their actions sinking in. They had made their choices, but those choices had consequences. Consequences that Johan had been living with every day since the war ended. Victor sat back in his chair, watching the exchange unfold with a mixture of sadness and empathy. He understood why Johan couldn't forgive them, not yet at least. But he also understood that this meeting, painful as it was, might be the first step toward healing. "I know you don't want to hear it, Johan," the soldier continued, his voice breaking. "But we're sorry. We should have done more. We should have fought for you." Johan stared at him, his eyes searching for any trace of sincerity, but all he saw was a man who had failed him. The apology, though long overdue, felt hollow, empty words in a world that had taken everything from him. The event was in full swing, with lights dazzling the stage and the sound of music echoing through the hall. It was a formal occasion where military and civilian authorities gathered to celebrate achievements and discuss new operations. While the celebration unfolded, no one paid attention to a filthy, barefoot man moving in the shadows of the event. Just another homeless man creeping closer to the heart of the ceremony. Nobody knew who he truly was, and the security guards were focused more on obvious threats than on invisible citizens. The soldiers on patrol spotted the homeless man approaching a restricted area. Without hesitation, one of the guards sharply ordered him to step away. The man, seemingly taken aback by the hostility, hesitated but did not respond. Impatient, the guard advanced to push him back. In the blink of an eye, more soldiers surrounded him, and soon he was physically shoved to the ground. No questions were asked, and the context of the situation was ignored. It was just another vagrant being forcefully escorted away. Little did they know, the man they were assaulting was about to change the course of history. As the homeless man was violently dragged away from the event, no one noticed who he really was. The operation continued, and the soldiers, confident that they were dealing with yet another street problem, resumed their vigilance. However, what they didn't know was that this man, whom they had assaulted without a second thought, was no ordinary homeless person. He was a decorated war veteran, and his mission was far more significant than anyone could imagine. The veteran, known only to a select few as the General, had infiltrated the event disguised as a homeless man as part of a covert operation. His goal was to investigate the very system he had once led and expose the corruption and abuse within the military structure. His mission was clear, but he had yet to reveal himself. Having lost everything after the war, his legacy, his medals, even his name, he had adopted this disguise to see the truth that many were too blind to recognize. Sitting on the cold ground, with the physical pain from the soldiers' aggression still lingering, he felt a strange sense of bitterness, but not anger. He felt pity. Pity for a system that now treated its heroes as enemies. Pity for future generations who would be taught to live under the same indifference and disdain. The atmosphere in the room had shifted as whispers began to spread. The man who had been dragged away like a criminal was no longer the unnoticed homeless figure, but rather a distinguished general, a decorated hero who had once commanded with great honor. Word reached the senior military officials about the identity of the man they had humiliated. Panic spread like wildfire. The event's organizers immediately took action, sending representatives to find the general and bring him back. But by the time they reached him, the veteran was no longer interested in public acknowledgement. He had learned enough. His suspicions had been confirmed. The corruption within the ranks was real, and it ran deep. The ceremony, a mere facade, had been a celebration of a military system that had lost its way. It was a system that had cast aside its most loyal, those who had bled for their country. As the guards escorted him back, his face remained unreadable. But deep within him there was a storm. Anger, betrayal, and a deep sadness that no one had seen coming. He was no longer part of this world, but he would not let it go without making them realize the wrong they had done. The military leaders gathered in a small, tense meeting room, their faces ashen with embarrassment. The general, whose face they had once respected, was now a symbol of everything they had failed to protect. A public apology was demanded, and the military protocol was clear. The leaders must meet with the general and beg for his forgiveness in front of the public. It would be a show of remorse, a last-ditch effort to restore some semblance of honor to a tarnished institution. The general, however, did not agree to the spectacle. He refused to stand before the very people who had thrown him away, treated him like dirt. His apology would not be a scripted act, but rather a real change, something that could not be erased with words. He made his decision. The truth would be exposed. Not just about him, but about the entire system. The public would know the hardships faced by the very men and women who had once laid their lives on the line. It would not be a quiet exit. If his life was to be forgotten by the military, he would make sure that the truth could never be swept under the rug. The press conference was set and the world waited. 4 days, the media had speculated, debated, and dissected the incident, trying to piece together what had happened that day. But none of them knew the truth, and the general had decided that only he could reveal it. The moment was his, and he would take control of it. Sitting in front of the cameras, he spoke quietly with the authority of someone who had seen it all. Someone who had sacrificed more than anyone could comprehend. I have been ignored, pushed aside, and disrespected by the very institution I swore to protect. He began, his voice steady. I spent years on the front lines fighting for freedom, only to return to a country that no longer valued me. The room was silent as the general continued, each word cutting through the air like a sword. What happened to me that day, the way I was treated like an animal, is not an isolated case. It is the result of a broken system, a military that has lost its sense of purpose and honor. He paused, looking directly at the cameras. You want to know why I'm here? Why I'm speaking today? Because I believe that truth and accountability still matter. The people who serve in our military deserve better. And the nation owes them a debt it has long ignored. The weight of his words hung in the air, and the entire nation held its breath. There would be no apology from him. Instead, the general had chosen to speak with raw truth, a truth that could not be ignored. In the days following the general's statement, the public response was overwhelming. News outlets flooded with coverage of his words, his confession, and the undeniable injustice he had suffered. Social media exploded, and for the first time in years, the plight of veterans was thrust into the national conversation. People who had once remained silent were now speaking out, sharing their own stories of neglect, abuse, and betrayal by the military system. Meanwhile, the government scrambled to contain the fallout. The military leaders who had humiliated the general were now scrambling to protect their careers, their reputation. Press releases were issued, but none of them could contain the damage done. It was too late for damage control. The truth had already been exposed. Behind closed doors, officials began to discuss the ramifications. Lawsuits were filed, investigations were launched, but none of these efforts could undo the harm caused by the general's public reckoning. He had become a symbol of what was wrong with the system, and the more the government tried to shift the narrative, the more it backfired. As the scandal raged on, the nation began to fracture. On one side, there were those who supported the general, who believed that the military had failed its veterans and had neglected its duty. These people rallied behind him, calling for sweeping reforms and changes in the way veterans were treated. They saw him as a hero, a martyr who had sacrificed not just his body, but his dignity for the truth. On the other side, there were those who defended the military, insisting that the general's actions were a betrayal, that airing the dirty laundry of the institution was a betrayal of everything they stood for. They dismissed the general's accusations as the ramblings of a bitter old man, someone who had failed to adapt to the modern military. But the more the debate raged, the more the public realized that this wasn't just about one man or one incident. It was about a system that had failed on a much larger scale. The general had forced a national reckoning, and now no one could look away. As the dust began to settle, the general's life took an unexpected turn. The country that had once discarded him now found itself listening to his message. His speech, broadcast across the nation, became a catalyst for change. Slowly, policy changes began to take shape, aimed at addressing the issues he had highlighted. The military was forced to confront its shortcomings, and a new generation of veterans found themselves with better resources and support. For the general, however, there was no victory celebration. His purpose had been to shed light on the truth, and in doing so he had sparked the change that was needed. But the personal cost had been high. He had sacrificed his peace, his quiet life, and the remnants of his dignity to reveal a truth that the world was not ready to hear. Yet in his heart there was no regret. The general had become something more than a soldier. He had become a symbol. And in the end, that symbol would inspire a new era of veterans, one where they were not forgotten. Introduction. Imagine being treated with violence and disdain by those who vowed to protect the country, unaware that you are, in fact, a decorated hero. This is the story of a war veteran, a man marked by the scars of past battles, who finds himself ignored, humiliated, and overlooked by the very society he fought to defend. At a public event, he becomes a victim of unnecessary brutality, but what his attackers don't know is that he's not just a homeless man. He's a general who now fights for his honor. Get ready for a story of struggle, revelations, and the pursuit of justice that will move you until the very last second. Don't miss a single detail of this epic journey, and if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now to stay updated with more stories like this. Conclusion. This general's story, from contempt to redemption, is more than just a personal battle. It represents the struggles many face in silence. As he exposes himself to the world, he's not only seeking justice for himself but for all the veterans who are often left behind. His courage to stand up against an oppressive system shows that even in the darkest of circumstances, truth and honor will always prevail. If this story moved you and you want to see more powerful narratives like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any content that will touch your heart. Share this story to inspire others, and see you in the next one.